Good Saturday morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our off-season hurricane outlook and discussion for today, December 30th, 2023. Final off-season discussion and final video of 2023 for us. Obviously, New Year's Eve is tomorrow, so that means it is our final video today. Obviously, by the time we talk again next week, it'll already be 2024. The year's gone by really quickly. I know it's very crazy, but here's to the new year, and hopefully here's to 2024 being a good year for everybody. So, let's start this final discussion, if you will, of 2023 by taking a look at the NOAA Coral Reef Watch sea surface temperature anomalies across the globe. And you notice basically the same things we've been talking about over the last few weeks. El Nino remaining persistent in the Pacific, strong El Nino definitely in place, and also atmospherically it still is there, though we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Warm Indian Ocean, that's something that we'll talk about later on as well. And also this very interesting southern Pacific also beginning to cool down, the south PMM as we call it, beginning to cool down, and this is, I believe, one of the early signs that we are seeing of La Nina begin to take on, and we'll talk about that more as well. But the Atlantic, very warm as a whole as well. Also starting to see very interesting. You notice warm over cold over warm. Basically, as we call it, a tripole that's beginning to set up, and I mean, that signal has actually already been there through most of the year. But very interesting that it's still with us even into the winter, and now we're now beginning to head into the heart of winter, and we still have the signal in the Atlantic. Plus the fact, if this does hold and this cools down as forecast next year, could be a very interesting picture. And I actually have a closer look at the Western Atlantic and the Western Hemisphere, I should say, because we're not focused in on just the Western Atlantic, and it kind of gives you perspective more. Warmer Pacific over warmer Atlantic, and very interesting that the Atlantic still remains very warm. Have that patch over the north, over just off the coast of northern Africa. That's been there basically the whole year, and the MDR as a whole remains probably at least a degree Celsius on average above normal, with pockets obviously much above that. We even see here some of these darker oranges, which represents 2 degrees Celsius and higher, and that's still there even for December. So just imagine how it'll be once we start seeing the Atlantic begin to warm up again heading into the spring of next year. If this indeed does persist, it'll be a very interesting picture indeed. Gulf of Mexico too also running pretty warm as well. You see this very big warm spot in the middle of the Gulf, probably the loop current that is keeping that area warm. And we've also not seen a lot of significant cooling in the Gulf so far. I mean, this month has been a very warm month, especially across a lot of the United States. Many areas seeing their warmest December on record. So, I mean, obviously the Gulf wouldn't really cool down that much, but I'm pretty sure as we get into winter and we start seeing a bunch of fronts move through, we'll probably see the Gulf slowly cool down. But that isn't really a concern for hurricane season, because usually the Gulf, by the time we get to hurricane season, is almost always ready for storm development. It is always warm enough for some sort of storm development in one way or another. Let's talk about the SOI now. The latest SOI dashboard over the last 30 days, we're still below -7. We're at -4 points, and the average SOI over the last 90 days also remains below -7 at -6.46 points, while the daily contribution, very interestingly enough, is in the positive territory. So we are starting to see some sort of regime in the atmosphere begin to show some sort of response towards away from El Nino. And this is very interesting because usually values in the negatives is what is more representative of an El Nino base state, while values in the positives of the SOI represents the opposite. Remember that magic number, as I like to call it, 7. That's what the Bureau of Meteorology from Australia, because this is from the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, that tracks the SOI, they like to look at 7 on both aspects of the scale. Trying to think of the best way to explain this, but basically, +7 is representative of La Nina atmospheric conditions and higher when it comes to the SOI dashboard, and -7 represents El Nino. And very interesting one, that both of these values are below the threshold that the Bureau of Meteorology considers for El Nino, and the daily contribution is above the threshold for La Nina in terms of the SOI. This doesn't mean much right now because it is only the daily contribution, but if we start getting a lot more of these values as we head into the next several weeks, that'll slowly begin to chip away at the average and probably bring it into the positive territory within a few months or so, and obviously in line with the decline of El Nino by then. Although you do notice probably over the last week or so, we've actually seen some sort of dip in the SOI, so probably El Nino response is still there, but obviously as we head in towards the next few months, that'll probably begin to slowly dwindle as we head closer towards what will probably be a cooler ENSO event next year. The Nino 3.4 though, probably in line obviously with the dip we've seen in the SOI values. We've seen Nino 3.4 SST anomalies rise. We're now at over 2.2 degrees Celsius above normal. Obviously a very strong El Nino in place, and you could definitely see that reflected on the subsurface anomalies. This is right by the Eastern Pacific. You notice all these dark oranges and reds, so there's definitely a lot of warm energy below the surface for this El Nino to continue to feed off of, but not for long. Notice this, and I've talked about this over the last few weeks, but a increasing area of cold over the Western Pacific that is building just underneath this El Nino. And this is one of the early signs of La Nina. We're starting to see a bunch of these cold anomalies just below the surface, and once they upwell and erode all this warmth that is right now coming to the surface associated with this El Nino, then this is when we'll probably see the La Nina take off. And Alex Borham talking about this, and this is in a thread that he talked about El Nino, posted earlier this week. He mentions that this event has been coupled with a strong IOD, which is the warm Indian Ocean. If we go back to this is the Indian Ocean, the IOD, which he's talking about, warm Indian Ocean, he mentions, and it has recently collapsed and has led to the large cold pool that we see in the Western Pacific, which will set off an upwelling Kelvin wave and end the event. The event meaning the El Nino that we're in right now. So basically, once this moves into the Eastern Pacific, that's the upwelling Kelvin wave. This will erode all of this, and eventually we'll head our way into La Nina. And he also mentions that with the warm Indian Ocean there, he mentions that'll slow down MJO, which is obviously, we know MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation, and once it passes through there, it'll destructively interfere with El Nino background state. So meaning El Nino background state, meaning MJO centered in the Pacific, while once it slows down and begins to set itself up in the Indian Ocean, that is a lot more in line with La Nina in terms of background. It's a lot more in line with what would favor transition to cooler ENSO, which he does say, and as 2024 begins. And very interestingly enough, he also does say not much of a spring barrier coming up this year, probably because there's a lot more certainty in the upcoming year that we will see a transition towards La Nina. But things are all coming together. We're starting to see the pieces kind of put themselves together, if you will. The big subsurface cold pool beginning to develop in the Western Pacific, that will eventually move towards the east and into the Eastern Pacific, and when that does happen, we'll definitely start to see El Nino go away, and that's when we'll probably be a lot more headed into the direction of La Nina. But people like Metz on Twitter, they're saying it. Even them, they're saying it too. The transition process is beginning to happen, And it's all a matter of time before we start to see this El Nino weaken into the new year, and we'll probably end up with a cooler, and so probably even heading into La Nina into next year. And it is definitely a very interesting picture, because if that Atlantic remains warm, especially if it remains as warm as it is right now, could mean next year could definitely have potential for another very busy hurricane season. When it comes to steering and all that, that is something we'll definitely look at as we head into the next year, especially as we head closer towards the season. Not really worth talking about right now. It's still far out, but we'll mention it and we'll talk about it as we head closer towards the season. All in all, a lot of interesting things happening though, and we'll definitely continue to watch it. Anyways, that is it for this discussion. Short, not really much to talk about. Not really much going on, especially with weather. That's been quiet too, and obviously we could hope it remains quiet, at least enough for us to have a good new year. Here's to 2024 being another good year. And if it wasn't a good year for you, hopefully 2024 is a much better year, and hopefully it's a much better year for us in general. So basically, with that being said, Happy New Year to everybody. Have a great, safe New Year, and we will talk again next Saturday.